The Big East, since they're not a football conference, they're not really talked about a lot. But when it comes to basketball, this is a basketball-rich conference that was top 2 last year in terms of just total conference strength. They were last year, and I think they're most likely going to be at least in the top 2 to 3 again this year. And that obviously starts with them having UConn as one of the best teams. We'll get to where they are later, but let's go ahead and start off with the lower tier. These are teams that I don't think are going to be even in contention to make the tournament. One of them I might see it, but I'll explain later. There's only 11 teams, by the way, in this conference, so a little bit shorter than others. But starting at 11, we have DePaul. Obviously, they've been the laughingstock. They won like nothing last year. But they have a bright future with former head coach of Ohio State, Chris Holtmann, and they're in a rebuild mode for sure now. They're going to try and build up their program for the better with incoming to look better for incoming recruits and all that stuff. So they're rebuilding. Obviously, they got a lot of mid-major transfers, so they'll probably be at least a relatively higher floor team to where they'll beat the teams that they're supposed to. But I don't think they're going to be the laughing stock or like horrendously bad or anything. They'll just be, hey, they're at the bottom, and it is what it is. Next is Seton Hall. I'm not as high as Seton Hall, to be honest. They changed up a ton. They lost a lot of depth. I don't really think they made up for the guys that they lost. Even the guys they have right now in terms of who they're expecting to take a step up, they didn't really show that to be the case last year. I think this is just a real downgrade for them. It's unfortunate. Their head coach was the head coach for Oral Roberts when they went on their big run, so he got this job, and last year they had a pretty good team, but I don't really love what they put together this year, to be honest. Number 9, we have Butler. Butler is a higher floor kind of depth team. They returned 2 of their best players, and then they also added McCaffrey from Iowa, so that's pretty solid. But this is just going to be like a solid run-of-the-mill team. Nothing crazy. Won't do anything nuts or completely fail unless they have major injuries. They'll just be like a solid team. So they'll be who they're supposed to be, probably not beat who they're not supposed to beat. Maybe they'll beat one team that's higher or 2. It happens, obviously, but don't think they're going to be pushing for a bubble or anything. And then the only team that I could see moving up into another gap would be Georgetown. Funny enough, Georgetown was second to worst last year, but I do think they could totally contend higher or literally be like last and a bust. I think they'll be better than anticipated. They kept their best player in Jaden Epps, who averaged 18 points per game. They got freshman Malik Mack from Harvard, who, while it was from a lesser school, I think can come in and contribute similarly than he did at Harvard. He had a very good efficiency rating, so I think that might be actually a pretty good transfer for them. Micah Peavy is a good two-way guard that they got as well. So I think they won't be bad, in my opinion, especially what that 9-win team was last year with former head coach Patrick Ewing. But I think they have some upside to maybe shake it up a little bit, at least in this conference. And I honestly, you know what? We're changing it right now. I'm gonna have Georgetown in this upper gap because there's only one other team I have with them, and that's Providence. These are teams that I think they're lesser. They're probably not going to make it, but they're bubble relevant. So Georgetown, we're going to move up right there on the fly. And Providence is my number 17. They're not a bad team, but they're just one that I think is just going to always maybe relatively be on the lower bubble, but just realistically never actually be in the tournament. They lost their stud in Devin Carter, who was a first-round pick to the Kings, which was a great pick for them, by the way. Awesome for the Kings. He was very good. Josh Arudo is their second-best player, and he's gone. They get Bryce Hopkins back from injury, so he's going to maybe, he was supposed to be the star, and then Carter came in and he took over. So maybe Bryce Hopkins can do what Devin Carter did, maybe. I'm just not really necessarily banking on it. They got some solid role player transfers from other Power 5 schools, but they just got a bit worse overall, and that's why I have them down here. But they're in this gap with Georgetown that I think they are bubble relevant, but I don't think they're on the right side of it. And then we have the next tier of teams that I think are in higher-ish tier bubbles / maybe potentially going to make it in. The Big East obviously doesn't have a ton of teams that always make it in, but I think any of the number of these teams that I'm listing here, it's 3 by the way, these next 3 teams, I think are in the bubble for sure. It's just depending on where. Number 6 is Villanova. I have them higher than a lot of different people. I think they're sneakily closer to the higher end of the Big East than others do. They kept their best player in Eric Dixon. They added a good transfer in Wooga Poplar, who's a great shooter from Miami, who was on that Miami Final Four team. They have Tyler Perkins, who is a very talented freshman for Penn last year, and is now going to go up to Power 5, and I don't think he's going to really take a giant step down. And the only thing is they're not as deep. They replaced the depth that they had last year with more higher-end guys, and I kind of like that because it seems like it just didn't really give them a good ceiling last year. So I think with these guys that they brought in, they have a relatively higher ceiling, and that's why I have them at 6. And then maybe if things go their way, they could contend to maybe just sneak into the tournament, or maybe they'll just be one of the few teams left out. Number 5 for me is Marquette. They are ranked 27, so they're just barely outside of the preseason poll, and I have them at number 5 in the conference. They're still a good team, for sure, but I personally don't think they made up for their major losses. They lost Oso DeGuzzaro and Tyler Kolek, both really good players for them last year, but they do return all their other key pieces. Cam Jones being the best one, David Joplin, Stevie Mitchell, all of them return. But other than guys coming back, they didn't really improve at all. They got 0 transfers. They did get Demarius Owens, who's a 4-star and the 81st best player in terms of recruiting coming out. But I think they're really heavily relying on a lot of their younger players to do better, which is possible. They have a lot of sophomores and juniors who were freshmen and sophomores last year who are going to get some more time, and we're going to see who steps up. The one I believe the most in is probably Stevie Mitchell. I think he's going to be the biggest impact in terms of improvement. But I don't think a lot of these guys are going to improve to the fact that they get back to where they were as like a top, 2 seed, and any of that stuff. I just don't see it. So still a good team, tournament team, viable, absolutely. Probably on the right side of the bubble, but I personally have them at 5. And number 4, I have Xavier, who is at 28 in the projected AP poll, and they are a very deep but more so experienced team with I think come tournament time it could really bode well for them, their experience. They did lose their 2 best players in Quincy Olivari and Desmond Claude, averaging 19 and 16 points respectively, but they still returned a good amount of players, and they got some good transfers. They are, risks from smaller schools, but they're coming from successful teams like Furman and Indiana State. So these transfers are not like scrubs, I think, from these smaller schools, and they could definitely produce. They also, the biggest thing, get Zach Fremantle back, who was injured and didn't play at all last year, and now has another year of eligibility, and is probably going to be their best player this year. So he's going to be a huge 3-and-D piece and just really emphasize what this team is, like a real 3-and-D team with obviously former Arizona head coach Sean Miller, which Sean Miller was the head coach when they obviously had all that DeAndre Ayton stuff going on. But he's a good coach. And he is trying to build a program here with Xavier. And I think they might be a sneaky team, and I do think that they will end up being a tournament team. Then we have a top 3. Yes, I think there are 2 other teams that can contend with obviously the previous national champion. And at number 3, I have St. John's. They are number 18 in the preseason AP poll. I have them at 3 in the conference. Rick Pitino, he's back in the mainstream of college basketball. Obviously, got kicked out kind of went to Elon, went to the tournament. Now he's at St. John's, and he's back, and he's looking to try and make the tournament this year after just barely missing it last year. I think the biggest thing for them is Kadari Richardson. You should definitely know that name. Kadari Richardson is one of the most underrated players in the country. He's gotten better every single year. He's a transfer from Seton Hall. Expect a really good year from him. Devion Smith was a really efficient guard for Utah last year. He comes over as a transfer. They have other young guys that are going to look to step in, like Zuby Ejiofor. This is a good team that's very quiet, and I think they should make the tournament this year, and I think they have the ceiling. Yes, I think they have the ceiling to win the conference, whether that's in regular season or most likely it would be some kind of really good Big East tournament run for them. I think it's definitely viable for this team. Number 2, I have Creighton. They are 15 in the preseason poll, and they're, I think, relatively not too far away from UConn, to be honest, in the Big East. And it's mainly because of UConn maybe not being as good as they were the past few years, but we'll get into that later. Creighton returns their starting center and point guard. Ryan Kalkbrenner being the best one. I think he's going to be in contention for Big East Player of the Year. I think he should be the favorite for that. Stephen Ashworth is a good point guard that they've had last year, who was from Utah State, and they got him last year. They got Pops Isaac, who was one of the higher-ranked transfers from Texas Tech, which we mentioned Texas Tech in the Big 12 video, so go check that one out if you haven't already. I'll do videos for a lot of different conferences. But they got Pops Isaac, who was one of the better transfers, so that's very good. But they did lose Baylor Shireman to the NBA and Trey Alexander. So those are 2 big losses for them, and I don't know if they have completely fully made up for those guys, but I think they are deeper this year. So while I think Pops Isaac can at least fill the role that maybe Trey Alexander or Baylor Shireman did, I think they're going to have to make up for the losses of one of those key starters in their depth, which by doing that, you would expect the ball to be able to go around more. Maybe Ryan Kalkbrenner, Pops Isaac, Steve Ashworth can all kind of take, swapping off in terms of getting more production that was left by like a Trey Alexander, and then the bench can pick up for it as well. So I still think this is a good team. I have them number 2 in the conference. I think they're definitely going to be a top 3 at the minimum, a 4 seed, but I think they could look at a 3 seed again this year. And then obviously number 1 is UConn. They are number 3 in the preseason poll. 2-time defending champion, the best coach in college basketball, staying, which I think is good. I don't want him to go to the NBA. I think you might as well just stay here in the success you got. And they're still totally in contention, but they're not the preseason lead, and I don't think they should. I don't think they should be in terms of the favorites to win it all, but they are absolutely in contention for sure. It's just, I do think there are other teams that maybe look a little bit better than them right now. They did lose a bit more than what they did in last year's offseason. So obviously 2 years ago, they won the tournament, and then last year's offseason, they lost a few guys, brought some guys up. So I think they lost more from this second title than they did from the first title. They were able to return Alex Caravan and Hassan Diarra, so that's good. They got Aiden Mahaney from St. Mary's, who I like and I think is going to fit in perfectly for Dan Hurley. They got Liam McNeely, who's he's a top 10 recruit in the country. Ahmed Noel, who's number 34. Isaiah Abraham, who's 58. So they got some good transfers, including I believe he's a 5-star in Liam McNeely. So they obviously were able to recoup and get some good guys. McNeely is probably going to have to step in and be the key contributing guy like Stephon Castle was last year, who got picked in his number 4 to the San Antonio Spurs in the NBA draft. They're still a very good team, absolutely. But with the losses of guys like Donovan Clingan and a few others, I don't really know if they got enough to make up for it. And if they did, it was in freshmen. And I think those freshmen are obviously not going to be as consistent to start off. So, I don't think they're exactly what they were last year. And they're going to have to expect a lot of higher play from younger guys. And maybe some guys that have been on the roster, like Jalen Stewart, who has been on the roster for a little bit. He, I believe, was a sophomore last year. So I think they could make up the production of the top tiers from just a lot of guys who were younger, breaking out or contributing. But I don't necessarily think they should be the favorite to win it all. They aren't, and I agree with that. But at least for now, I'm going to have them as on top of the Big East. But that's just for now. If anything happens, don't be surprised. I'm just saying.